The history of the Wild West has been told as if women were only wives and victims. In reality, some of them robbed, killed, and led gangs that were just as feared as the men's. Subscribe, because this video is about the female outlaws history tried to forget. Number 1. On a hidden bend of the Canadian River, in Indian Territory, there was a piece of land where the law simply couldn't reach. It was called Younger's Bend, and the woman who owned that place was someone no sheriff wanted to go up against: Belle Starr. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley, she grew up in Missouri and learned early what it meant to live on the wrong side of the law. After marrying Sam Starr, a Cherokee, she turned her own home into a hideout. There, horse thieves and wanted men found food, a place to sleep, and the silence of people who didn't ask questions. In 1883, her luck ran out. Belle was put on trial for horse theft and convicted by the feared Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge. She served her sentence and went back home, but her reputation had already taken on a life of its own, and newspapers back east started calling her the Bandit Queen. The end came in 1889. 2 days before her 41st birthday, Belle was shot and killed in an ambush from behind on a dirt road. No one was ever arrested for the crime. To this day, no one knows who pulled the trigger. Number 2. Kate Bender and the Death Inn. In the early 1870s, people traveling along the dirt roads of Kansas would often stop at a small inn to eat and sleep. Many people walked through that door and were never seen again. The place was run by the Bender family: the father, the mother, the son, and Kate, a young woman who claimed to be a healer and said she could talk to spirits. She was the one who lured in the travelers. She would greet the guest with a smile and seat them in a chair with their back to a curtain. On the other side, someone waited with a hammer. After the blow, the body would fall through a trap door into the basement, where it was robbed and then buried in the orchard behind the house. In 1873, suspicious neighbors went there and found the house empty, with their belongings left behind. When they dug up the property, they pulled around 12 bodies from the ground, including men, women, and even a child. The family had disappeared days earlier, as if they knew the walls were closing in. There were searches, arrests, and rumors for years, but no one was ever able to prove where the Benders actually ended up. Number 3. Catalanie and Little Britches. Imagine 2 teenage girls riding across the Oklahoma plains in the early 1890s, armed and on the wrong side of the law. Their real names were Anna McDoulet and Jenny Stevens, but the Old West knew them as Catalanie and Little Britches. The two became involved with the Doolin-Dalton gang, also known as the Wild Bunch. They didn't rob trains or banks. Their job was different. They sold whiskey illegally and, above all, worked as lookouts. When federal marshals got close, they would ride ahead to warn the fugitives, giving them time to disappear into the dust before the law showed up. But it didn't last long. In 1895, Marshal Bill Tilghman and his deputy Steve Burke went after them and arrested them after a hard chase. Since they were still underage, they weren't thrown into a regular jail cell. They ended up being sent to a reform school back east, far away from everything they knew, to learn how to stay on the right side of the law. Number 4. Pearl Hart and the Last Great Stagecoach Robbery. By the end of the 19th century, the Old West's days were already numbered. Trains were crossing the desert, the telegraph could deliver news in minutes, and the great outlaws were disappearing. It was right around that time that a woman did something no one expected. In May 1899 in Arizona, Pearl Hart and an accomplice stopped a stagecoach near the town of Globe. To pull off the robbery, she cut her hair short and dressed like a man. With a gun in her hand, she took the passengers' money, about $400, and fled into the wilderness. But the two got lost along the way and were arrested a few days later. Pearl ended up in Yuma prison, which wasn't even set up to hold women. That's when the story really took off. Newspapers across the country were talking about the stagecoach bandit. She gave interviews, posed with a rifle in her hands, and became a public favorite. Released around 1902, Pearl Hart simply disappeared from the records. To this day, no one knows for sure where she ended up. Number 5. Sally Skull, the Armed Rancher. In mid-19th century Texas, when the border with Mexico was still no man's land, few names commanded as much respect as one woman's. Sarah Jane Newman earned the nickname Sally Skull and built her life buying and selling horses and mules back and forth across the border. She ran the business on her own, rode like any cowboy, and was always armed. People said she could draw her revolver faster than a lot of men, and no one ever caught her off guard. Sally also became famous for marrying 5 times. Some husbands died, others disappeared from the story, and there were people who said it was better not to cross her. During the Civil War, she hauled bales of cotton to Mexico, keeping trade alive while the country was tearing itself apart. Around 1866, Sally Skull disappeared without a trace. Suspicion fell on her last husband, who many believed was responsible for her death. Her body was never found, and the fate of the armed rancher remains a mystery. Number 6. Laura Bullion, the Wild Bunch seamstress. Imagine a woman who rode with some of the most wanted men in the Old West and ended up spending the rest of her life sewing curtains. That was Laura Bullion. She rode with Butch Cassidy's gang, the famous Wild Bunch, and was known by the nickname Della Rose. She wasn't just an outlaw's girlfriend. She helped with the plans, hid stolen money, and lived alongside Ben Kilpatrick, the gunslinger nicknamed the Tall Texan. In 1901, the law caught up with her in St. Louis with bills from a train robbery near Wagner, Montana. She spent a few years in prison. When she got out, she did what no one expected. She disappeared from sight. She changed her name to Frida Lincoln, moved to Memphis, and spent the rest of her days sewing clothes and curtains without drawing anyone's attention. Laura died in 1961 at an old age. She was one of the last survivors of that outlaw world, a quiet bridge between the Old West and the modern world. Number 7. Etta Place, the woman who vanished into thin air. She appears in a single photo taken in New York in 1901. Well-dressed, elegant, posing next to the Sundance Kid, one of the most wanted outlaws in the Old West. And that's pretty much where her story begins and ends. No one knows for sure who she really was, not her real name or where she came from. All we know is that she ran with the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and Sundance's gang, people who robbed banks and trains and then disappeared into the dust before the law could catch up. When things got too hot in the United States, the 3 of them boarded a ship headed for South America. They ended up in Argentina, tried to run a quiet ranch, but the outlaw life always seemed to come knocking again. Around 1906, Etta simply disappeared off the map. There's no record of her death, no marriage record, no record of her ever going back home, no clues. She went down in history like a ghost, one photo, one alias, and a whole lot of questions that no one to this day has been able to answer. Number 8. Big Nose. Kate, the woman who outlived them all. While the gunslingers of the Old West died young, often by the bullet, a Hungarian woman named Mary Catherine Horany did the opposite. She outlived them all. She came to the United States as a young girl and soon fell into the harsh life of dance halls and prostitution. That's where she crossed paths with the man who would define her story, the gunslinger Doc Holliday. For years, the two lived together, fighting, breaking up, and getting back together, surrounded by shootouts, drinking, and rigged card games. Once, they say, she set fire to a building just to get Doc out of jail, and it worked. He died of tuberculosis in 1887, still a young man. Kate moved on. She married again, ran a boarding house, and worked as a cook in mining camps. Old and broke, she pulled one last trick. To get into the Arizona Pioneers' home, which only accepted Americans, she swore she had been born in Iowa. It worked. She died in 1940, nearly 90 years old, peacefully in bed, the kind of ending almost none of the tough men around her ever got to have. Number 9. Madame Mustache and the Final Bet. She arrived as a mystery and left the same way. No one really knew where she came from. Eleanor Dumont showed up in the American West around 1854, a young French woman with a strong accent who opened a gambling house in Nevada City, California. There, rough men took off their hats before entering because the owner wouldn't tolerate fighting or swearing at the table. For more than 20 years, she followed the money. From California to Nevada, she opened and lost saloons, dealing with prospectors, gunslingers, and con men. Her reputation spread from one mining camp to another. Over time, a dark mustache appeared on her upper lip, and people started calling her Madame Mustache, behind her back, of course. But her luck turned. The debts piled up, her friends disappeared, and age took its toll. One morning in September 1879, her body was found on a road near Bodie. Beside her was a bottle of morphine. She had made her final bet, and this time she knew she wasn't going to win. Number 10. Lahi Dino, the woman who beat the game and came out on top. She was born Carlotta Tompkins in Kentucky around 1844, but the world knew her by another name, taken from a barroom joke. Lots of dinero, a lot of money, and money was something she knew how to win. At a time when women didn't even sit at poker tables, Lottie sat down and cleaned the men out. In Fort Griffin, Texas, she faced armed gunslingers without flinching. They say she kept playing calmly while gunshots rang out outside the saloon. Red-haired, elegant, quiet. No one knew where she came from, and she wasn't telling. They even say Lottie inspired Miss Kitty from the old TV series Gunsmoke. But the real woman was too smart to die at a card table. Once she had enough money, she walked away from the cards, married Frank Thurmond, and moved to Deming, New Mexico. She became a respected member of the community, helped build up the town, and died an old woman in her bed in 1934. Almost everyone from that world ended up in a shallow grave. She came out on top. Number 11. Rose of Cimarron, the legend that grew bigger than the truth. Her name became a symbol of the Old West, but almost everything people say about Rose Dunn came from newspapers and fiction. The romantic version says that during the Ingalls shootout in Oklahoma in 1893, she crossed through the gunfire to help her wounded boyfriend, the outlaw George Bitter Creek Newcomb. The story caught on, a brave young woman risking her life for love. The problem is, almost none of it can be proven. The real facts are few and far less glamorous. Rose was barely more than a teenager, connected to the Doolin-Dalton gang, the group that terrorized the region. And the ending is harsher than any romance. Her own brothers, who hunted fugitives for money, ended up killing Newcomb to collect the reward. The rest, the brave-hearted young woman and the tragic ending, was the work of the press, which took an ordinary life and turned it into a legend. The real Rose died an old woman, married and respected, far away from any gunfight. Number 12. The common fate of female outlaws. Forget the high noon showdown with the sun beating down and the street empty. In real life, almost none of these women met an end like that. Belle Starr, the so-called bandit queen, was shot in the back and killed in 1889 in an ambush that was never solved. No one was ever arrested for it. Ella Watson, known as Cattle Kate, ended up being hanged by a group of ranchers who accused her of cattle rustling without a trial and without any evidence. Others were slowly worn down by morphine, tuberculosis, or poverty. Many spent years behind bars and came out without a penny, old before their time. And a good number simply disappeared, like Etta Place, who vanished without a trace. No photo, no grave, no record of how it ended. The truth is hard to swallow. Behind the romantic legend that made it into the movies, these women didn't die like heroes. They died cornered, forgotten, or alone in an old West that rarely forgave anyone who crossed the line.